As we all know, Minneapolis has been the epicenter of the protest movement ever since George Floyd was killed by police in that city on Memorial Day. And Mayor Jacob Frey, he has been right in the middle of it, trying to calm down his population while at the same time embracing their calls for both accountability and change. But this all came to a head when he was literally booed out of a rally because he did not support defunding that city's police department. My next guest, mayor of the other Twin City, St. Paul, and he has a very interesting personal story that he brings to his job. Melvin Carter, the first African-American to lead St. Paul, and his father was one of St. Paul's first African-Americans to join the force after a court-ordered desegregation. Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm curious. I know your father retired from the job, but you must have had a lot of interesting conversations about what he saw, the video that the rest of us saw, with not only Officer Chauvin with his knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd, but the other officers standing there. Has your dad and yourself, were you shocked by what you saw, or are we just shocked that America's shocked because now video is becoming more and more prevalent?
You know, Will Smith once said, racism isn't new, it's just now being recorded, or something like that, you know? And one of the things that I like to remind myself and some of the folks I know who make policy is that if you think about this last 10 years in particular, that we've seen video after video after video, the only logical answer is the only thing new is the proliferation of cell phones, of cell phone cameras. And so we can't assume that this is some new treatment that suddenly cropped up in the last 10 years. My father and his father and his father could tell you about this type of treatment. Our police chief said on the news this week that he's told his officers that if they find anything honorable at all in that video, they should come bring him his badge right away. And that's, I think, consistent with what my father's response has been as well.
I'm curious, have you found in your city, and again, I'm sure this is also one of the conversations, that it's a few bad apples, or is it the whole system? Is it rooting out the people that shouldn't have a badge, or do you have to almost tear it down and start all over again?
You know, that's a great question. And we've heard, you know, folks from the White House saying it's just a few bad apples. You made the distinction at the beginning of this conversation between Officer Chauvin, the officer who had his knee on George Floyd's neck for those excruciating 8 minutes and 46 seconds of the video. But then the other three officers who people keep saying they didn't do anything, which is inaccurate. They did something. Two of them helped hold him down while the other one guarded the scene to help make sure that that could happen. That undeniably, to me, illustrates a culture of policing, that this really is so much more than just those individual officers. This is about a culture of policing in which every single human being I know can look at that video and say, this is despicable, that never should have happened. And yet somehow there were four officers at the same time in the same place who looked at that and didn't think it was their job to change it. Yes, we have deep systemic issues to take care of in order to kind of turn the page on this chapter of American history that has been open since the founding of our country. I think we're going to have to find ourselves addressing legal precedents. I think we're going to have to find ourselves addressing both federal, state level, and local level policy. And we're certainly going to have to address some of the components written into police union contracts that make it so difficult to hold someone accountable, even in the face of something as disgusting and despicable as the video of George Floyd's murder.
We're going to hear from members of Congress, but whether the change comes federally, it comes from cities or states or some combination thereof, what does meaningful reform look like? And when you go to your constituents, when will you know they feel it?
I think that the calls right now that I'm hearing predominantly are really two things. One is accountability. We want to know that these officers who are in our community, who have a badge and who seemingly have unlimited power and unchecked power to wield deadly force when they deem it necessary, We want to know that they're being held accountable to the highest standards. As our chief here in St. Paul always says, he always asks our officers three questions: were your actions reasonable? Were they necessary? And were they done with respect? And if you can answer that all three of those questions with a yes to our chief, you're probably in a decent space. If you can't, then you're going to have a tough conversation with them. So that's the first question: is how do we put in place the type of policies that ensure that everyone knows what our standards are, what our rules of engagement are, when officers can and cannot use force, and that when they disobey those things, when they fall below our standards, how do we make sure that we're able to hold them accountable, and whether that's legally accountable or at least get them removed as a police officer. The second piece is changing our perspective, zooming out and changing our perspectives around law enforcement. And I think we're seeing a national rejection of the notion that keeping our neighborhoods safe is just as simple as police, prisons, and prosecutors, that we demand and we deserve a far more extensive set of investments to set our children, to set our families, and set our neighborhoods up for success far before a crime is committed.
I saw your police chief, and to be fair, he was not late to the party. I think it was the next day. He mandated that all members on the force watch the video, all of it. And as you said, he said if anybody feels this, scintilla of sympathy for what any of these officers are going through, they basically, in so many words, don't belong in this force. When you hear calls for defunding the police, is that what's necessary in your city? Can you fix this by pieces, or do you need to start all over?
When I hear those calls, I mean, what I hear is a really strong conviction that in America we spend $100 billion a year on policing. We spend another $80 billion a year on prisons. And these strategies, like I was saying earlier, police, prisons, and prosecutors, they're all designed to kick in after a crime has occurred, after something bad has occurred. And if we can constantly afford to spend billion after billions of dollars on these strategies, that these law enforcement strategies that kick in after a crime has occurred, but can never afford to clear the Section 8 waiting list. We can never afford to raise the minimum wage. We can never afford to establish universal child care, or all of those other types of proactive investments that we all know would make our neighborhoods more stable and set our families and communities up for success proactively in a way that can reduce the number of times we call 911 in the first place. I think that's what people are rejecting. And that's what people are saying. We've got to be much, much, much more in balance with how we allocate our public resources, because they illustrate where our public values are.
To come back to your family tree for a second, Mr. Mayor, your grandfather, Navy veteran, and then he became a Pullman porter. And the name George, obviously everyone thinks of George Floyd, but it also had a different meaning, because you said there were 10,000 Georges, or as it's been written as such. For our audience who doesn't understand the significance of the name, please explain.
Sure. My grandfather was Melvin Carter Sr. He was, you're right, a Navy veteran. He was a musician who played his trumpet for 4 different United States presidents. And instead of trying to go seek fame and fortune on the road, he decided to stay home, worked 30 years as a janitor in our public schools to raise his family. One chapter of his life, like you said, was working on the railroad as a Pullman porter. And when you were a Pullman porter, there were African-American men who worked on the railroad, some women, but to spare the white customers from having to learn the names of those workers, all of them were called George. All of them were called George, no matter what your name was, no matter what your specific position was, they were all called George. And that for me is why this is maybe so personal for us, because I know, and every African-American accountant or architect or mayor or whatever your career is, we all know that absent this suit and tie that I'm wearing right now, we are all George. And there's really no amount of accomplishments or money or credentials that can change that fact.
Finally, a year from now, next June, you and I sit down and talk. Are you optimistic that not just St. Paul, but this country is going to be in a different place than we are right now because of the Floyd tragedy and everything that's happened in the 17 days since?
Boy, that's a lot of things that have happened in the 17 days since. And I'll tell you, one of the emotions that I feel is deja vu, because we've seen these funerals before. We've chanted these slogans before. We've said never again before. And we've had a lot of well wishes from community members, from policymakers before. And yet we continue to find ourselves kind of in this space over and over again. If something gives me hope, it's the number of people who have just come out of the woodworks, one, to support each other. In St. Paul, we had a very devastating, heartbreaking night of destruction as some folks took to the streets. And I like to make I like to differentiate between the protesters. We had some amazing, beautiful, heartfelt, warm protests, some of which I joined. But then we also had people who came to town. And came out in the community for the purpose of causing destruction. But I tell you, the next morning, we saw people just come out of the woodworks with a shovel, a broom, a bag to just help each other clean up together. We saw businesses who were still boarded up because their windows were busted, who before even fixing their own windows, turned their business parking lot into a supply drive to help families have the access to the formula or diapers or food or whatever it is that they needed. This energy that we're seeing in the country, if we can channel it correctly, and we've kind of issued this call to peace but not patience, I think we'll find that this is the energy that has created our country. It's the energy that has abolished slavery. It's the energy that saw us through civil rights. And it's exactly the energy that's going to carry us through to the next chapter.
St. Paul Mayor Melvin Carter, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I wish you and your city the best of luck.
Thank you much. Thanks for having me on.
All right, everyone, when we come back, we will pivot to the COVID outbreak, which, as you know, far from over. After the break, an emergency room doctor joins us to discuss a possible second wave, how cases are spiking in several states, and much more.